We are teaching young people born in the 21st century in America and the rest of the West that they are guilty by dint of being born here. You are guilty of colonialism because some of your ancestors may have engaged in colonialism. You're guilty of genocide. You carry the guilt of genocide because 300 years ago, people who may not be ancestors of yours but looked like you did this thing, and so on and so on. And I said in the War on the West that this was a very, very dangerous thing because it's a mechanism of guilt with no alleviation mechanism for forgiveness. There's no way to alleviate the guilt. You're just being told you're guilty and you're stuck with it.
Now, you can see the protests as a manifestation of that attempt to expiate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the conclusions I come to is that this protest movement has been projection on a vast scale. The students accuse Israel of things that the students have been told that they themselves are guilty of. That they themselves...
Well, they see Israel as the vanguard of Western colonialism.
Exactly.
It's the whole story.
So this is a giant mechanism of projection, which is why I say when it comes to these protesters, particularly the students in the West, I say, tell me what you accuse the Jewish state of. I'll tell you what you were taught you're guilty of.
Right, of course,
you were taught that you're guilty of.
Douglas Murray argues the West is suffering from a catastrophic failure of imagination, forgetting that pure death-worshipping evil is a real force in the world. Our universities fuel this blindness, teaching students a gospel of self-loathing that offers one narcissistic path to redemption, scapegoating Israel for their own inherited guilt.
They come up inside mosques, well, they come up inside hospitals. Even in 2014, the BBC acknowledged that the Hamas leadership were coming up from tunnels underneath the Shifa hospital, which is one of their command headquarters. By the way, all of that is, for anyone who cares about this, completely against every law of war. The Geneva Conventions, every convention of war is you are not allowed to fight, you're not meant to fight in civilian clothing, you're not meant to fight and fire from places of worship. You're not meant to stockpile ammunition in hospitals. You're not meant to make civilian homes targets for reasons that our species thought we all understood.
Sufficiently victimized perpetrators have no reason to abide by any standards.
No,
How about
and of course,
that for an argument?
And of course, militarily, this is all to Hamas's enormous advantage because, again, they know that if there is a stockpile of ammunition or a terrorist or a tunnel entrance or whatever in a civilian home, and even if the Israelis tell all the locals to get out, the world's media will say that Israel bombed or invaded a civilian home.
Or a hospital or a place of worship.
There's a member of the Israeli
None of those words have the same meaning.
None of them.
In Gaza that they do in the West.
None at all. It's whenever it's reported that, that a hospital has been hit, it's usually reported in the world's press, as Hamas wants, that the Israelis just decided to bomb a hospital, as if they're so evil, these Israelis, that they even bomb hospitals. There was a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, who I quote in the book because he lost his son fighting in Gaza in the aftermath of October the 7th, and the next day he lost his nephew, also fighting in Gaza. His nephew was killed because as the Israelis were trying to do this incredibly delicate military operation to get back the hostages, destroy the leadership of Hamas, and minimize any possible civilian casualties, Gadi Eisenkot's nephew was fired upon from a mosque by Hamas terrorists who gleefully opened fire on him and his unit.
They do this for one reason. They know the IDF will be forced to respond, and the world's media, serving as Hamas's unwitting PR firm, will dutifully report it as Israel attacks a hospital or Israel bombs a mosque. The cost of this perversion isn't abstract. It's Gadi Eisenkot, watching his own nephew get murdered by terrorists, gleefully firing from a place of worship.
And they were meant to be sticking to Hamas were doing that. The Israelis were trying to stick to the normal laws of conflict and not just destroy the mosque. And so they lost soldiers. This is another example of the way in which Hamas do this. Any normal society that valued the life of their own civilians, like America, Britain, Israel, would, if it knew that its people were going to come under bombardment, often do what the Israelis did in the south and indeed across much of the country, which is you build bomb shelters in every home. And you have bomb shelters in every civilian area. And across the south of Israel, that's the case, as it is in the north, because it's been being shelled by Hezbollah for 20 years. But only in Gaza do you get a situation where, and I quote one of the Hamas leaders saying this in an interview with Al Arabiya last year, this Hamas leader was asked by a friendly Arab journalist, why, if you say the civilian casualties in Gaza are so high, why can't you allow the civilians of Gaza to shelter in your tunnel networks that you've built underneath Gaza? And the Hamas leader says, but the tunnel system is not for the civilians. The tunnel system is for our fighters and for our weaponry. And the interviewer says, well, who's to look after the civilians? And he says, well, the international community.
Right. Well, that's just testament to the fact that the Palestinians are essentially cannon fodder for the eternal war against Israel and the United States.
Yes, but it's even worse than that, that of course, an army that fights by the laws of war, which the IDF does, like the American army, like the British army, makes mistakes for sure, like the American army, like the British army, but that fights by the laws of war, when it encounters a terrorist army like this.
One side, Israel, spends billions building bomb shelters to protect its civilians. The other, Hamas, spends billions digging terror tunnels. This is the very core of their strategy. Maximize their own civilian casualties to weaponize the world's empathy against Israel. Every dead Palestinian child is a PR victory. Meanwhile, Israeli soldiers die because they hesitate to level a mosque that has become a machine gun nest.
The civilized army seeks to minimize the civilian casualties, as the IDF has done, and anyone who claims that it hasn't just does not know what's been going on for the last 18 months.
And believes Hamas reports.
And believes Hamas reports.
Why would anyone ever believe Hamas reports?
Yeah, it's. I mean, why go to a mass murderer to find out their account of their actions? You know. But the point is that when an army like that encounters an army that not just desires death for its enemy, but desires death for the people it purports to govern, and with a kicker in it, seeks death itself. This is a realm of fanaticism and what I call it's a death cult, a cult that literally worships death. The leadership of Hamas, who I quote in the book, have for decades boasted about the extent to which they love death, embrace death. And one of the underlying things in this book, as you know, which we'll come on to doubtless later, but is what happens if a society that actually values life encounters a death cult that worships and glories in death for its foes, but also for itself. And we have
suffering and death.
We have seen such movements throughout history. We have seen them, but most of the world has forgotten about them. And I would argue that Israel, to a great extent, forgot about them until 6:30 in the morning on October the 7th, 2023.
Possessed by the spirit of Cain.
Yes.
And that accounts for some of the anti-Semitism too. So let me run something by you. I want to flip to how the world turned.
The West, and even Israel, fell victim to a profound failure of imagination. We became so comfortable, so post-historical, that we forgot that the spirit of Cain, pure, unadulterated, death-worshipping malevolence, is not a metaphor. It is a real and recurring force in human affairs. October 7th was not a policy failure. It was a catastrophic collision with a reality we had convinced ourselves no longer existed.
So it is the case that when people develop post-traumatic stress disorder, they relatively rarely develop it in response to a tragedy, even if it's a painful tragedy. They tend to develop it, one risk factor is being naive. Seeing the world through rose-colored glasses, let's say, assuming goodwill on everyone's part, including your own, and then encountering a situation, sometimes a situation that you're deeply involved in, where malevolence raises its head. The West is very sheltered and I would say blind to malevolence, blind to its existence. In the academic realm, there's no discussion of good and evil. Evil is an archaic term, and malevolence is a consequence of trauma, right? A consequence of privation. And that's simply not the case. It's now, I read a book a while back, and I don't remember which one it was, unfortunately, but it described the erasure of the Byzantine Empire from the Western imagination. Now, I was a relatively old person before I really had any sense at all of the extent of the Byzantine Empire or the catastrophe of its demolition. And the author of this particular book believed that the defeat of the Byzantine Empire by the Islamic world, and maybe by the psychopaths of the Islamic world, was so traumatic to the West that we just erased it from our historical memory. And then it seems to me, Douglas, that something like that is going on right now. I mean, you look, let's talk about the universities for a moment. Now, there's a fair bit of pathology in the universities, a fair bit. It's like top to bottom. They're absolutely incorrigible as far as I'm concerned, especially the Ivy Leagues. They should be ashamed of themselves. They should be deprived of all funding as far as I'm concerned. In any case,
the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a civilizational trauma so profound that the West simply edited it out of its own story. It was a 1,000-year-old Christian empire, the direct heir to Rome, overrun and extinguished by a jihadi force. To admit that a sophisticated, established civilization could be annihilated by sheer violent fanaticism was too terrifying. It shattered the narrative of inevitable progress. So we forgot.
The protests that emerged there and all across the world, you detail out, and with some great sadness and amazement. But I think part of it is that it's not within the purview of the people who are protesting to replace their theory that the victims are uprising with the notion that a malevolent cult of death that worships sadistic suffering and annihilation exists. It's too far outside their worldview. Now, there's more to it than that, because Iran is, you saw that the Ayatollah, this is the most amazing thing. The Ayatollah himself congratulated the American universities, or the universities of the UK for that matter too.
He congratulated the Western students for joining the anti-colonial struggle. Not mentioning to the students that, of course, he, Ayatollah Khamenei, had ordered the gunning down of their contemporaries across the streets of Tehran in 2009, and on many other occasions.
A minor issue.
But when Iranian students come out on the streets to protest against the actual oppression of the Islamic Revolutionary government in Tehran, Ayatollah Khamenei, who congratulates the Western students for uprising, shoots the students who uprise in Iran. But that's a detail.
Yes, it's an ignorable detail, clearly. Then there's another issue that seems to be operating at the universities. A disproportionate number of the protesters, or the protester puppets, you might say, are young women, right? And so there's something to that too, because it's in the nature of young women, I would say, to adopt the mien of sympathy towards victimization and fail to see the predators lurking underneath underneath the rocks, let's say. Women haven't traditionally fought wars. They're not necessarily equipped to identify actual enemies. Their proclivity is sympathy, and that's exacerbated in the case of naivety. And there's a great intermixture of pride in that too, in that female sympathy can, what would you say, overcome the pathology of victimization. That's Eve, as far as I'm concerned, clutching the serpent to her breast. And the universities have become feminized to a great degree. And then there's this incredibly deep in people.
Universities have bred a pathological compassion, leaving students blind to true malevolence. They champion a death cult, earning praise from the very Ayatollah who murders his own student protesters. This feminized empathy, severed from wisdom, mistakes predators for victims. It is the modern Eve clutching the serpent to her breast, convinced her sympathy can neutralize the venom of a genocidal ideology.
Overall, I think in the West have no idea how pathological the universities have become. The social sciences, the humanities run on an oppressor-victim narrative. and everything is seen through that light. And you can learn the tenets of the oppressor-victimizer narrative in 5 minutes, and then you can explain the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So-
And by the way, there's a very healthy dose of narcissism thrown into the whole thing, which is that to the extent that any students in American universities get taught anything about the Middle East, they will be taught Edward Said's claim of Orientalism, which, of course, is a claim that is, by Said's own admission, spilt way beyond even the claims that he made in his book. Said's insight, if you can call it that, was that when Westerners approached the Arab and Muslim world, they did so through the eyes of Westerners, which is an observation so banal that only the academy could extrapolate out a whole course from it. I mean, what eyes were
especially without giving some due credit to the fact of Western eyes.
Well, if people when Napoleon goes to Egypt, one of the things he does is to order a massive catalogue of all of the riches and treasures of ancient Egypt, a catalogue which Egypt itself had not produced to that point.
Right.
And one of the people who Napoleon gets on to do this, and who founds the Cairo Museum, by the way, ends up also being one of the people who breaks the code of the Rosetta Stone, giving the lost languages back to the region. But anyway, people don't need to know any of that.
Another detail.
That's all just,
it's another detail.
Why do you need to know that when you can say, this is what Said really
Western
gifted.
eyes who defined ancient artifacts as treasures to begin with.
Right.
Right. Then it becomes self-evident. Right.
The oppressor-victim narrative is the university's simple narcissistic gospel. Its key text, Said's Orientalism, rests on the banal insight that Westerners see through a Western lens. From this, a whole discipline of grievance is born. Even Napoleon's cataloguing of Egyptian treasures or deciphering the Rosetta Stone is recast not as scholarship, but as colonial violence. Defining this treasure becomes an act of oppression.
Just consider the enormously advantageous aspect of narcissism to this mix, because the narcissistic thing that Said helped to give American and other Western students was nothing in the world happens unless you in the West make it happen. You make it so. The Palestinians, like all the Arabs, the Muslim world, the developing world as a whole, does nothing of its own volition. It can't even make mistakes on its own dime. It's you that made them do it. What did we in America do to cause this? Is the lens, the only lens through which an American student will be taught to look at the world. Why is this happening in China? What did we do to China will be the way, but everything is interpreted. So this is just not fit for purpose for understanding the world, but it's hugely narcissistic because, among other things, I mean, and you can see this in the spilling out of protests across American and other Western campuses. One of the things I say at one point in the book is, what level of delusion and narcissistic delusion do you have to be in to think that you, at the University of Columbia, or Berkeley, or Yale, or Princeton, or Oxford, can dictate war policy 2 continents away? Who was waiting for your opinion exactly?
It's an extension.
In counterterrorism strategy in densely built-up urban areas. When you say that your university is central to the funding of Israel's war, what do you mean? What do you mean? What, you at your campus is at the center of the war? Really? Really? You're at the center of world events by sitting in the middle of your quadrangle in a tent?
Students are taught that the West is the sole actor on the world stage, and all other peoples are merely passive objects of our actions, stripped of their own will or agency. The absurd result is students at Columbia believing they can dictate Israeli war policy from a tent on the quad, a breathtaking delusion that places their campus at the center of a foreign conflict.
Let me put a twist on that and tell me what you think. So it seems to me that the Pride story is slightly, perhaps, more complicated than the tale that you laid out. So there's this initial presumption of Western centrality, let's say, that you pointed to. But see, one of the things I saw at the University of Toronto shortly before it became impossible for me to work there was this insistence by my colleagues that there was no moral pathway, no more productive and moral pathway that a student could be invited to take than the pathway of protest.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
So now see, it's not only that the students are characterized by this overweening certainty in Western, what would you say?
Dominance and malevolence.
Yes. It's that so they posit this malevolent force that's centered in the West, but then they position themselves as adversaries to that force, and
Yes.
that's the prideful twist.
Well,
it's like, we're so horrible here in the West, but I'm so good that even though I'm part of the West, I'll do everything I can to oppose that. And then they're egged on by their idiot professors.
I quote a student at Columbia who described himself as a first-generation low-income student, the first in his family to go to university, certainly the first to go to Columbia. You would have thought, most of us would have thought, damn, I'm lucky.
Mm-hmm.
But he describes how straight away he was taught what he described as the rich history of protest at Columbia, and remembered thinking, when it kicks off again, I want to be at the center of it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about you, but I think student days should be used for many things. But the idea that you should make yourself central to the protest movements of your time as your demonstration of virtue in your years of study that's taught. That's taught. That young man was taught that.
Definitely.
It's because
by the culture too.
By the
not
culture.
Just by
it's
the
because the professors at totally pointless studies institutes and other things, and sometimes in serious programs, are actually telling their students this. There are a number of former faculty of Columbia.
This is a psychodrama of pride, built on a foundation of self-loathing. First, universities indoctrinate students with the belief that their own civilization is uniquely malevolent. Then, they offer a narcissistic redemption, becoming a virtuous protester against it. The student, taught that protest is the highest moral calling, becomes a useful idiot, sacrificing an education for the thrill of righteous rebellion.
That I've spoken to, and some present still, who say this to me. They say, we were teaching this for years. This was all being boiled up by us, by the faculty, for years ahead of this. But the other thing that happens then, just to add to your riff on the sin of it, is that, as you know, one of the conclusions I come to about this is that this has been projection on a vast scale. And it really took talking with quite a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists about this phenomenon in the last 18 months to work this out. There's this rule, as you know, that I go into in the book that I've mulled on a lot, that I got from the great Soviet Jewish writer Vasily Grossman, who appears intermittently throughout the book. And Vasily Grossman had this terrific dictum in the middle of Life and Fate where he says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. This is unbelievably relevant again and again and again. The Iranian Revolutionary Government says that the Jewish state is a colonialist enterprise. The Iranian Revolutionary Government is colonizing the Middle East since 1979.
There's nothing colonist about Islam.
Oh, no. I mean,
it was only the fastest growing empire in the history of the world.
And as you know, Muhammad, when he spread Islam, only did through by persuasion and kindness.
Right, and that still obtains today. We'll get back to that.
But every time this I mulled on this subject in recent years, the Grossman's rule absolutely applied. People using the Jewish state, just as they have the Jewish people throughout history, as a projection mechanism for their own failings. And the place where I realized this became very relevant to the American university and the Western universities was, what were the things the students were accusing the Jewish state of? Genocide, ethnic cleansing, white supremacy. So you would laugh at that one. They've never been to Israel.
That's a good one.
But anyway, so ethnic cleansing, genocide, white supremacy.
The faculty spent years brewing the poison, and the students drank it. The result is a projection on a mass scale, perfectly explained by Grossman's rule. Students marinated in guilt over America's actual history of slavery and ethnic cleansing accuse Israel, a nation of indigenous people, of those very sins. It is a psychological laundering of their own inherited shame.
The various sins that they will always lob at Israel, and they were throwing this at Israel from October the 7th, as they had in the years before, but they really got a push on it after that. And I was thinking throughout this period, as I saw the protests in the West, I thought, why are these terms so familiar? The conclusion I came to was, and it actually was a follow-on from my previous book, The War on the West, where I talked about what was being taught to a generation. And as you know, one of the things I said in that book was, we are teaching young people born in the 21st century in America and the rest of the West that they are guilty by dint of being born here. Mm-hmm. You are guilty of colonialism because some of your ancestors may have engaged in colonialism. You're guilty of genocide. You carry the guilt of genocide because 300 years ago, people who may not be ancestors of yours but looked like you did this thing, and so on and so on. And I said in The War on the West that this was a very, very dangerous thing because it's a mechanism of guilt with no alleviation mechanism for forgiveness. There's no way to alleviate the guilt. Mm-hmm. You're just being told you're guilty and you're stuck with it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you can see the protests as a manifestation of that attempt to expiate.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the conclusions I come to is that this protest movement has been projection on a vast scale. The students accuse Israel of things that the students have been told that they themselves are guilty of. Mm-hmm. That they themselves,
well, they see Israel as the vanguard of Western colonialism.
Exactly.
It's the whole story.
So this is a giant mechanism of projection, which is why I say when it comes to these protesters, particularly the students in the West, I say, tell me what you accuse the Jewish state of. I'll tell you what you were taught you're guilty of. Mm-hmm.
Right, of course,
you were taught that you're guilty of.
Yeah, and no wonder that people rebel against that, because how the hell else are they going to expiate the guilt?
We teach Western students they bear an unabsolvable inherited guilt for colonialism and genocide. With no path to forgiveness, they outsource this guilt onto a scapegoat Israel. So, any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.